The Shade Collective had perfected invisibility over 17 million years of evolution and technological advancement. Their species, the Umbereth, existed in a spectrum of reality that most sentient beings simply couldn't perceive, phase-shifted just enough from baseline physical dimensions that they moved through the galaxy like ghosts through walls. They had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, documented wars and peace treaties, witnessed the birth of new species and the extinction of old ones, all without ever being detected. Their archives contained secrets that would topple governments and rewrite histories across 1,000 worlds, gathered through patient observation from a vantage point of perfect concealment. The Umbereth had made invisibility not just a survival mechanism but an art form, a cultural identity, a source of pride that bordered on arrogance. They were the unseen eyes of the cosmos, the silent witnesses to everything, and they had grown comfortable in their absolute certainty that no species in the known universe could perceive them. The Galactic Council's intelligence networks had detected anomalies for decades, classified files that disappeared only to reappear altered, private conversations somehow leaked despite quantum encryption, strategic plans that enemy forces seemed to anticipate with impossible accuracy. The pattern suggested the presence of an unknown observer, something or someone moving through secured facilities without triggering sensors, without leaving traces, without being seen. Investigative committees were formed, security protocols were revolutionized, entire departments were restructured in attempts to identify the breach. Paranoia spread through the council's upper echelons as officials began to suspect each other of espionage, unable to conceive that the problem might be something beyond their technological capacity to detect. The Umbereth watched these efforts with detached amusement, their confidence in their imperceptibility absolute and unshakable. When humanity petitioned for council membership, the Umbereth assigned a small observation team to Earth as standard procedure, expecting nothing more than routine documentation of another emerging civilization. Observer Kesvith led the team, a veteran of 3,000 years of surveillance operations who had never once been detected by any species, in any environment, under any circumstances. She materialized her phase-shifted form inside the human space station that orbited Earth, moving through the corridors with the casual confidence of someone who knew with absolute certainty that she was invisible. The station was a modest construction by galactic standards, utilitarian and functional rather than elegant, filled with humans going about their duties with the earnest determination that characterized young spacefaring species. Kesvith positioned herself in the central command hub, intending to observe their coordination protocols and assess their technological development. The human who walked past her barely broke stride before stopping abruptly, turning back with a confused expression that immediately triggered warning signals in Kesvith's consciousness. Lieutenant Sarachan tilted her head, her eyes moving across the space where Kesvith stood phase-shifted from normal reality, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Is someone there?" Chen asked the empty air, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty but not dismissal. Kesvith froze, which was irrational because movement while phase-shifted was undetectable, but the human's gaze was tracking toward her position with uncomfortable accuracy. Chen took a step closer, squinting at nothing, her hand moving unconsciously to her hip where no weapon was holstered. "I could swear I saw something, like a shimmer in the air." She called to a colleague across the room, pointing to the exact location where Kesvith stood. "Rodriguez, come look at this. Does the air look weird to you right here?" The second human approached with the casual skepticism of someone humoring a colleague, but his expression changed when he reached the indicated position, his eyes narrowing as he examined the space around Kesvith's invisible form. "There is something," Rodriguez confirmed, moving his hand through the air in a pattern that came dangerously close to Kesvith's phase-shifted body. "Like heat distortion, but the temperature readings are normal. Could be a sensor glitch, or maybe some kind of refraction from the observation window." Chen wasn't satisfied with that explanation. Kesvith could read it in her body language, the way she continued to study the empty space with the focused attention of someone who trusted her instincts over her instruments. Kesvith initiated emergency protocols, backing away slowly while transmitting an alert to her team. 17 million years of evolution, 3 millennia of personal operational experience, and a human with no special equipment or training had nearly perceived her presence. The impossible had just brushed against the edges of possibility. The observation team convened in their phase-shifted vessel beyond the moon's orbit, their communication channels buzzing with unprecedented alarm. Kesvitha's report was met with initial disbelief until the others began sharing their own experiences. Observer Thindak had been tracking a human military exercise and reported that several soldiers had exhibited similar behavior, pausing to look at empty spaces, commenting on feelings of being watched, adjusting their positions as if unconsciously avoiding phase-shifted Umbereth observers they shouldn't have been able to detect. Observer Mektal, stationed at a human research facility, had triggered what humans called security concerns, when multiple scientists independently reported sensing presences in their laboratories, leading to facility-wide sweeps with equipment that, while unable to detect Umbereth technology, had been deployed in response to accurate human intuition. The pattern was undeniable and unprecedented. Humans couldn't see the Umbereth, their technology couldn't register phase-shifted beings, but somehow, impossibly, they knew something was there. The Shade Collective's high command responded to the reports from Earth with bureaucratic skepticism that gradually transformed into scientific fascination and then into something approaching concern. A species that could partially perceive the Umbereth threatened not just operational security but the fundamental assumption upon which their entire civilization was built. They dispatched their most accomplished researchers, led by archival master Vornthesis, who had spent 4,000 years documenting the perceptual capabilities of every known sentient species in the galaxy. Vornthesis arrived at Earth with equipment designed to measure the absolute limits of human sensory perception, confident that the reports represented statistical anomalies rather than genuine capability. The testing protocols were designed to be exhaustive, controlling for every variable, eliminating every possible explanation except the one that the Umbereth refused to accept, that humans possessed some innate ability to detect what should have been utterly undetectable. The experiments began in controlled environments, with phase-shifted Umbereth observers positioned at varying distances and angles from human subjects who had been recruited under the pretense of participating in psychological studies. The humans couldn't see the observers, their eyes tracking past the invisible forms without conscious recognition. But their bodies told a different story. Physiological monitors registered subtle changes when Umbereth observers moved closer. Elevated heart rates, minor fluctuations in skin conductivity, microscopic adjustments in posture and breathing patterns. The humans reported feelings of unease, sensations of being watched, inexplicable urges to turn around or move to different positions. When asked to point toward the source of their discomfort, they gestured with disturbing accuracy toward the locations of phase-shifted observers they should have had no way of detecting. The correlation was too consistent to dismiss, too pronounced to attribute to chance. Vornthesis expanded the testing parameters, moving beyond controlled laboratories into real-world environments where humans operated without awareness of being observed. A phase-shifted Umbereth researcher positioned themselves in a crowded human marketplace, standing motionless among the flowing crowds, and within minutes, people began unconsciously avoiding that space, creating a bubble of emptiness around an invisible presence. A team of observers attended a human military briefing, and the commanding officer repeatedly paused mid-sentence, his attention drawn to the corner where 3 Umbereth stood phase-shifted and theoretically imperceptible. A pair of researchers followed a human child through a park, and the child turned back repeatedly, eventually telling her parent that the invisible friends were following them, a statement that sent chills through the Umbereth monitoring the experiment because the child's language suggested awareness rather than mere instinct. The breakthrough in understanding came from an unexpected source, human neuroscience research that the Umbereth had dismissed as primitive but which contained insights their own species had overlooked in their millions of years of technological development. Humans possessed what their scientists called mirror neurons, neural structures that activated not just when performing actions but when observing others perform those actions, creating a kind of unconscious empathy and social awareness. But humans had developed these structures to extraordinary sophistication, far beyond what evolutionary necessity should have required. Their brains were constantly building predictive models of their environment, anticipating threats and opportunities through pattern recognition that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. When something disrupted those patterns, when the predicted model didn't match the sensory input, Humans experienced it as intuition, as instinct, as the feeling of being watched by something they couldn't see. Vornthesis realized with growing unease that the Umbritha's phase-shifting technology made them invisible to direct perception but couldn't eliminate their gravitational presence, their displacement of air molecules, the subtle ways they still affected the physical reality around them. Most species lacked the neural architecture to detect such minute discrepancies between expectation and reality, but humans had evolved in environments where detecting hidden predators meant survival, where reading social cues from minimal information determined status and safety, where pattern recognition at the edge of perception separated the living from the dead. They had developed brains that were prediction engines of extraordinary sensitivity, capable of detecting anomalies too subtle for their conscious minds to articulate but powerful enough to trigger alarm responses that kept them alive. The Umbrith had achieved perfect invisibility by every measurable standard except the one that mattered most. They couldn't hide from the unconscious awareness of a species that had spent millions of years learning to see what shouldn't be there. The implications rippled through the Shade Collective with the force of theological crisis. For 17 million years, they had defined themselves by their imperceptibility, had structured their entire society around the absolute certainty that they moved through the universe as perfect observers, unseen and unseeable. The discovery that humans could detect them, even imperfectly, even unconsciously, challenged not just their operational capabilities but their identity as a species. Emergency sessions of the collective's governing bodies debated responses that ranged from avoiding human space entirely to more aggressive options that some advocated but most rejected as both unethical and potentially catastrophic. The humans didn't know what they were detecting, couldn't consciously perceive the Umbrith or defend against them, but the very fact of partial perception changed everything. A secret known to two parties isn't a secret but a shared awareness, and the Umbrith were confronting for the first time in their recorded history the reality that they might not be the universe's only witnesses. The Umbritha's response protocols had been developed over millions of years for dealing with species that might someday develop the technology to detect phase-shifted observers, but those protocols had never anticipated a species that could perceive them through biology rather than instruments, through instinct rather than innovation. Observer Kesvith volunteered to return to the human space station, this time with explicit authorization to make contact if circumstances warranted it, carrying communication devices that could bridge the gap between phase-shifted reality and baseline physical dimensions. The mission parameters were simple in statement but complex in implication. Determine if humans could be made consciously aware of Umbrith presence, assess whether peaceful coexistence was possible, and evaluate the broader threat or opportunity that humanity represented to the Shade Collective's way of life. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had not forgotten the shimmer in the air, the sensation of presence without form that had triggered her instincts in the command hub. She had filed a report that was taken seriously by human security but ultimately attributed to stress or perceptual artifacts, explanations that Chen accepted intellectually while emotionally remaining convinced that something had been there. When Kesvith materialized in phase shift near Chen's quarters during an off-duty period, Chen's reaction was immediate and visceral. She sat up from her bunk, her eyes tracking the empty space where Kesvith stood, her breathing accelerating even as her conscious mind insisted that nothing was there. "I know you're there," Chen said to the apparently empty room, her voice steady despite the physiological markers of fear. "I don't know what you are or how you're doing this, but I know something is watching me." Kesvith made a decision that would later be analyzed in Umbrith strategic sessions for generations. She activated the communication device, allowing her voice to reach across the phase barrier without fully materializing into baseline reality, a technological compromise that maintained some operational security while enabling dialogue. "You are correct, Lieutenant Chen," Kesvitha's voice emerged from nowhere, modulated to approximate human vocal ranges. "I am here, observing. Your species possesses a unique capability that we did not anticipate. You can detect what should be undetectable." Chen's response was remarkably controlled given the circumstances, her training overriding her shock as she stood and positioned herself with her back to the wall, eyes scanning the room for the source of the voice. "Show yourself," she demanded, her tone carrying authority despite the impossible situation. "If you want to talk, I deserve to see who I'm talking to." The Umbrith had protocols for first contact scenarios, but those protocols assumed controlled environments and diplomatic preparation, not spontaneous revelations in a junior officer's quarters. Kesvith partially dephased, allowing her form to become visible as a translucent shimmer, humanoid in basic structure but clearly alien, her body seeming to exist at the intersection of solid and ethereal. Chen's eyes widened, but she didn't retreat, didn't call for security, didn't react with the aggression or panic that the Umbereth had observed in so many other species when confronted with the unknown. Instead, she studied Kesvith with intense curiosity, her fear present but subordinated to the human tendency toward inquiry that the Umbereth had noted in their observations. "You've been watching us," Chen stated, not a question but a conclusion. "How long? Why?" The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and covered territory that neither participant had anticipated exploring. Kesvith explained the Shade Collective's history, their role as observers, their 17 million years of remaining unseen by every species they had encountered until now. Chen listened with the focused attention of someone receiving information that would reshape her understanding of reality, asking questions that revealed both tactical intelligence and philosophical depth. "So we're the first species to detect you," Chen summarized, her analytical mind processing implications, not through technology but through instinct. "What does that mean for your people? And what does it mean for mine?" The question cut to the heart of the matter with a directness that Kesvith found simultaneously refreshing and unsettling. Humans, it seemed, didn't waste time on diplomatic niceties when confronted with existential questions. Kesvith explained the Umbereth's uncertainty, their concern that humanity's capability might force a fundamental change in the Shade Collective's operational paradigms. "We have built our entire civilization on being unseen," Kesvith admitted, the translator conveying emotional undertones that crossed species boundaries. "Your species threatens that in ways we are still struggling to understand. We could avoid human space, maintain our invisibility by simply not observing your civilization. But that would be the first time in our recorded history that we have had to limit our observations due to the limitations of our subjects rather than our own capabilities." Chen absorbed this, her expression thoughtful, and then she said something that would later be quoted in Umbereth strategic analyses as a defining moment in human-Umbereth relations. "Maybe being seen isn't a limitation. Maybe it's an opportunity." The concept was so foreign to Umbereth thinking that Kesvith initially struggled to process it, but Chen elaborated with a persuasive clarity that demonstrated why humans, despite their relatively brief presence on the galactic stage, had already begun to influence the Council's dynamics. "You've spent 17 million years watching everyone else, learning their secrets, understanding their vulnerabilities. But you've never had to be understood in return. You've never had to trust anyone with your secrets because you've never been vulnerable enough to need that trust." Chen stepped closer to Kesvith's shimmering form, her instinctive wariness of the unknown being deliberately overridden by conscious choice. "Humans can sense you. We can't see you clearly, can't track you perfectly, but we know when you're there. That makes us unique in your experience, but it doesn't have to make us enemies. It could make us partners, if you're willing to try something you've never tried before, being known." The proposal that Lieutenant Sarah Chen brought before her superiors within the human space program was unprecedented in its implications and audacious in its scope. She suggested formal diplomatic relations with a species that had been observing galactic civilization for longer than humans had existed, a species that possessed technology generations beyond anything humanity could currently develop, a species that could move through secured facilities like ghosts and had been doing so throughout human space without detection until now. Her commanding officers reacted with predictable skepticism until Chen presented evidence that Kesvith had authorized her to share, detailed recordings of human activities that the Umbereth had observed, information that couldn't have been obtained through any known espionage method, proof that Earth had been under observation by an invisible presence that meant no apparent harm but had gathered intelligence that would be invaluable or catastrophic depending on the Umbereth's intentions. The human response demonstrated both the species' remarkable adaptability and their tendency toward pragmatic optimism that other galactic civilizations often mistook for naivety but which was actually a conscious choice to assume the best while preparing for the worst. Within weeks, a joint human-Umbrith working group had been established with the goal of transforming a relationship based on one-sided observation into something approaching mutual understanding. The humans brought to the table their unique ability to detect phase-shifted beings through instinct and intuition, while the Umbrith offered knowledge accumulated over millions of years of observing galactic civilizations. The initial meetings were awkward, conducted in rooms where humans tried to focus on shimmering forms at the edge of perception while Umbrith observers struggled with the novel experience of being acknowledged rather than invisible. The breakthrough came when a human neuroscientist named Dr. James Morrison proposed a collaborative research project that would benefit both species. "You want to understand how we perceive you," Morrison explained to the assembled Umbrith delegation, his eyes tracking the translucent forms with the concentration of someone deliberately using an underdeveloped sense. "We want to understand the neurological mechanisms behind our own intuition. What if we work together to map the exact signatures you create in human neural patterns? You'd learn how to minimize your detectability if you chose to, and we'd gain insights into human consciousness that could advance our understanding of the brain by decades." It was a proposal that acknowledged the Umbrith's need for operational security while offering humans scientific advancement, a trade of knowledge that neither species could achieve independently. The research that followed produced unexpected results for both parties. The Umbrith discovered that human perception of phase-shifted beings varied dramatically based on individual neural architecture, with some humans barely able to sense Umbrith presence while others, like Lieutenant Chen, possessed almost preternatural awareness. The humans, analyzing their own brain activity during Umbrith encounters, identified neural patterns associated with social awareness and threat detection that operated far below conscious perception, essentially proving that human instinct was a sophisticated computation system rather than mystical insight. But the most significant discovery was made by a young Umbrith researcher named Pell North, who observed that humans who were consciously aware of Umbrith presence actually generated different neural signatures than those who were unconsciously detecting phase-shifted observers. The implications were profound. The Umbrith could potentially be completely invisible to humans who knew they existed and chose to suppress their instinctive responses, but would always be partially detectable to humans who didn't know to control their automatic perception systems. This finding led to a proposal that would have been unthinkable to the Shade Collective just months earlier: controlled disclosure of Umbrith existence to specific human populations, creating a cadre of individuals who were consciously aware of and trained to work with phase-shifted observers. The Umbrith governing councils debated the proposal with an intensity that bordered on existential crisis, because it represented a fundamental shift from 17 million years of absolute secrecy to selective transparency. The decision ultimately came down to a simple reality. Humanity was expanding into the galaxy rapidly. Their unique perceptual capabilities meant that Umbrith observers would be increasingly detected in human space, and attempting to maintain total invisibility while operating around humans would eventually lead to confrontation rather than cooperation. The Shade Collective could choose to engage with humanity on terms that preserved some operational security while building trust, or they could withdraw from observing an emerging species that would likely become a major galactic power within centuries. Withdrawal was antithetical to everything the Umbrith represented, so engagement became not just the logical choice but the only choice that aligned with their identity as the universe's witnesses. The program that emerged was called the Observer Exchange, though humans informally termed it the Ghost Protocol. Select human intelligence operatives, scientists, and diplomats were given clearance to know about Umbrith existence and were trained to work alongside phase-shifted observers in various capacities. The Umbrith, in turn, began sharing selected intelligence from their vast archives with human authorities, information about galactic politics and threats that humanity would have taken decades to discover independently. It was a partnership built on mutual benefit rather than sentiment, acknowledging that both species had something the other needed. Humans offered the Umbrith a way to continue their observational mission in an era where their traditional methods were becoming compromised, while the Umbrith offered humans knowledge and perspective that could only come from 17 million years of watching civilizations rise and fall. The relationship was not without tension, as both species struggled to overcome ingrained patterns of behavior, but it represented something unprecedented in galactic history. A cooperation between the seen and the unseen, the watched and the watchers, based on the revolutionary premise that being perceived didn't have to mean being vulnerable. The first joint human-Umbrith operation targeted a smuggling ring that had been moving weapons through neutral space to a conflict zone where galactic law prohibited arms trafficking. The Umbrith had observed the operation for months, their phase-shifted observers documenting routes, identifying key players, and mapping the network with the thoroughness that came from millennia of practice. But observation without intervention was the Umbrith way, and they lacked both the authority and the inclination to take direct action. Humans, conversely, had limited intelligence-gathering capabilities but possessed both the legal jurisdiction through council agreements and the willingness to act on confirmed information. The partnership seemed natural in theory, but executing it required both species to operate far outside their comfort zones. Agent Marcus Webb led the human tactical team, accompanied by 3 phase-shifted Umbrith observers including Kesvith, who had become the primary liaison between the species. The operation began with Webb's team boarding a suspected transport vessel under the pretense of routine inspection, while the Umbrith observers moved through the ship's interior gathering real-time intelligence that they transmitted directly to Webb through neural interface technology that human and Umbrith engineers had developed specifically for this partnership. Webb experienced the information as intuitive knowledge, sudden certainties about the locations of hidden compartments and the intentions of crew members, his brain processing Umbrith transmissions in ways that bypassed conscious analysis and emerged as the same instinctive awareness that had allowed humans to detect phase-shifted beings in the first place. The smugglers had prepared for human inspection protocols but had no contingency for invisible observers who could move through walls and locked compartments. Kesvith positioned herself in the ship's cargo hold, documenting weapons caches that were concealed behind false bulkheads and transmitting their exact locations to Webb. When the smugglers realized their operation was compromised and attempted to resist, the Umbrith observers provided real-time tactical intelligence that allowed Webb's team to anticipate every move, neutralize threats with minimal violence, and secure the vessel with an efficiency that would have been impossible through human capabilities alone. The smugglers were captured confused and defeated, unable to comprehend how the human team had known exactly where to look and how to respond to resistance that should have caught them off guard. The operation's success rippled through both human and Umbrith communities, validating the partnership to skeptics on both sides who had doubted whether cooperation between such fundamentally different species could produce practical results. For the Umbrith, it represented the first time in their recorded history that their observations had directly influenced events rather than merely documenting them, a shift that some found exhilarating and others found disturbing. For humans, it demonstrated that their instinctive ability to detect the undetectable wasn't just a curiosity but a foundation for a strategic advantage that no other galactic species possessed. The partnership was formalized through official channels, with the Galactic Council reluctantly acknowledging the Umbrith's existence after 17 million years of successful concealment, a revelation that shocked the galaxy and raised uncomfortable questions about what other secrets the invisible observers had been keeping. The broader implications of the human-Umbrith partnership extended far beyond tactical operations. The Shade Collective began sharing historical observations that rewrote accepted galactic history, revealing manipulations and deceptions that had been hidden for millennia, providing context to events that had shaped civilizations. Some council members reacted with outrage at the violation of privacy, but others recognized the value of having an impartial witness to history, particularly when that witness could now be consulted rather than merely observing in silence. Humans became the intermediaries between the Umbrith and the rest of the galaxy, the only species that could reliably detect phase-shifted observers and therefore the only species the Umbrith trusted to represent their interests in galactic forums where physical presence was expected. Dr. Morrison's neurological research produced technologies that allowed humans to consciously control their perception of phase-shifted beings, essentially giving them the ability to turn off their instinctive detection when appropriate while maintaining the capability to activate it when needed. This development gave the Umbrith a measure of operational security they thought they had lost, knowing that trained human operatives could choose not to perceive them, while simultaneously giving humans a tool that no other species possessed. The technology became classified at the highest levels, both to protect the Umbrith and to preserve humanity's unique advantage in a galaxy where every species was constantly seeking edges over their competitors and allies alike. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, whose instinctive awareness had initiated the first contact, found herself promoted to a newly created position as the chief human liaison to the Shade Collective. She worked directly with Kesvith to develop protocols for human-Umbrith cooperation that would become the template for future interactions. Their relationship evolved from the awkward first contact in Chen's quarters to a partnership built on mutual respect and the recognition that both species were being fundamentally changed by their interaction. The Umbrith were learning to be seen, to trust, to participate rather than merely observe. Humans were learning to perceive beyond their conscious senses, to value knowledge over immediate action, to understand that some of the most powerful forces in the universe were the ones that most beings never knew were there. On the anniversary of first contact, Chen and Kesvith stood together in the observation deck of the human space station where their first encounter had occurred, looking out at Earth rotating below them. Kesvith had dephased enough to be clearly visible, a gesture of trust and comfort that would have been unthinkable to the Umbrith a year earlier. "Your species has changed us," Kesvith admitted, her translated voice carrying harmonics of emotion that had become familiar to Chen. "For 17 million years, we believed that invisibility was our greatest strength. You have shown us that being seen by the right eyes, by allies who understand our value, might be even stronger." Chen smiled, her eyes tracking Kesvith's form with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to consciously process what her instincts detected. "And your species has changed us," she replied. "You've taught us that what we feel, what we sense beneath conscious awareness, isn't superstition or imagination but a legitimate form of perception that we've been dismissing as irrational. You've validated human intuition by being the thing that proves it works." The partnership between humanity and the Shade Collective would continue to evolve, facing challenges and opportunities that neither species could anticipate. But it had already accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. It had proven that the barriers between species weren't just technological or biological but perceptual and psychological, and that sometimes the most profound connections emerged not despite differences but because of them. Humans had given the Umbrith something they hadn't known they needed, the experience of being truly known by another species, of having their existence acknowledged and valued rather than merely tolerated or feared. The Umbrith had given humans something equally valuable. Confirmation that the universe contained wonders beyond direct perception, that human instincts were trustworthy guides to invisible realities, and that sometimes the most important truths were the ones you felt rather than saw. Together, they had transformed a potential conflict between the seen and the unseen into a collaboration that would reshape galactic civilization, proving that even after 17 million years of certainty, the universe still had the capacity to surprise those willing to see what others couldn't, and to be seen by those they'd never imagined could perceive them.